So let's talk about this anti-abortion. There's yet another. The Alabama and the Senate passed the big anti-abortion bill that virtually eliminates abortion. I think it's still a heartbeat bill, 6 weeks, but it's obviously going to be challenged. The governor of the state, Kay Ivey, didn't say whether she was going to sign it yet. She hasn't. She wants to see the final bill. It would be the strictest in the U.S. It makes it a felony for doctors to perform an abortion at any point during pregnancy, punishable up to 99 years in prison. Doctors who attempt to perform an abortion could face up to 10 years in prison. Women would not be liable. The woman having the abortion would not be liable. And their bill makes an exception for a mother who has a serious health risk. Anyway, this goes on to the bills, is added onto the bills like in Georgia, Kentucky, Ohio, and Mississippi, and obviously is a challenge to the court. It's obviously saying to the court, to the Supreme Court, here it comes. Jeffrey Toobin, who's the hysterical anti-Trump legal analyst at CNN, he points out that this is basically the result of Trump. This is Trump, as he says, keeping his promises. Cut number 8.
Candidate Donald Trump said repeatedly he was going to appoint justices to the Supreme Court who will vote to overturn Roe versus Wade. What he meant by that, I think, was he will appoint justices to the Supreme Court who will vote to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Sounds like it.
That's what he's done. There have been 2 confirmations. Anthony Kennedy, who was a vote for Roe versus Wade, has been replaced by Brett Kavanaugh, who will vote to overturn it. There are now 5 votes on the court to overturn Roe versus Wade. All Alabama is doing is following the news. They have seen who was appointed to the Supreme Court, and elections have consequences, and this is one of them.
Well, you know, that's fair enough, and Trump is very dedicated to keeping his promises. Good for him. And the change in the court does give people hope. But this is something that's been happening for quite some time. You know, abortion is at its lowest rate ever. It has been falling. People seem to be having less promiscuous sex, and you don't know why these things are happening all the time. People put forward ideas that really are just prejudices that they have. People on the left say that abortion is falling because there's more access to contraception. Possible. People on the right say it's because people have woken up to what abortion is, and that the arguments can't stand, the arguments for abortion can't stand. And so in some sense, as I said to Knowles, I think earlier in the week, in some sense, what the right is doing, the anti-abortion forces are doing, is they're seizing hold of a zeitgeist, as the left did with cigarettes. The left created this incredible panic about cigarettes, probably justified, it seems to me. Cigarettes do seem to be incredibly bad for you. They created this incredible sense that it was dirty, it was ugly, it was not sexy to smoke, when everybody knows it's incredibly sexy and cool to smoke. It's just not good for you, you know. So that they created this kind of atmosphere and then started banning them from public places. They couldn't quite get to the point where they were banning them inside your own home, but they tried. They pushed it that far, and that's where people said, no, that's too far. But they did everything they could to basically take away the area, the living area in which you could smoke. And that's what the right is now doing with abortion, is trying to take away the area in which you can have abortion. The thing about Roe v. Wade that is so important is it is not just a bad thing to take away from the people their right to make laws in their own states, which is what the federal system is supposed to be about. The Constitution, I always have to emphasize this because people don't know it, the Constitution is an enumeration of the government's powers. If it's not listed in the Constitution, the government can't do it. Many of the founding fathers didn't want there to be a First Amendment because they said there's nothing in the Constitution about regulating speech, so the government can't do it. Fortunately, wiser heads prevailed, and they said if the government can seize power, it will. Let's tell them explicitly they can't do it. Does anyone think that the government wouldn't have taken away our guns or our free speech rights away before if they could have done it? Okay, so that is what the Constitution is. It's bad law. And on MSNBC, they have a guy named Danny Cevallos, who's one of their legal analysts, and he just points out it's bad law.
There's a very good chance, if this makes it to the Supreme Court, that Roe v. Wade will be overturned, because we have known since the 70s that Roe v. Wade stands on a weak foundational basis. Whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, Roe v. Wade is really about, do we have an individual fundamental, do women have a privacy right in the Constitution that overrides state legislatures' abilities to make laws affecting abortion? And it's interesting to note that year 1900, almost every state prohibited abortion. By the time Roe v. Wade was decided, it was down to 30 states. The trend was that prohibiting abortion was going away. But now, by giving it to the Supreme Court, it creates a precedent that can be overturned. And the bottom line is that even if you are pro-choice, the right to privacy does not exist either in the history or the text of the Constitution, which is why Roe has always been ripe to be overturned.
That's an amazing thing to listen to an MSNBC legal analyst sounding almost exactly like me. He says almost exactly the same things that I've been saying for a long time. And because it's bad law, because everybody knew it was bad law, everybody knew it was a power play, everybody could see it, it drove us apart. And it taught the left that they didn't have to take other people's opinions into account if they could just override them by pure force. And that's why we get things like these ladies at Stanford who think an opinion has to be silenced because they don't think they have to argue. They don't think they have to debate. They don't think they have to win the argument in local elections. They just think they have to silence the opposition. I truly believe that Roe v. Wade went a long way to training the left to not making arguments. Just to show you what I mean, Linda Greenhouse. Linda Greenhouse was the New York Times Supreme Court reporter for 1,000 years. They used to say that her liberal leaning and her badgering of justices to move left would move the justices left. They called it the Greenhouse effect. And a couple of times she was even scolded by her own newspaper for being such a leftist activist. But she gave an interview to the New Yorker, I believe it was, where she was talking about abortion. And she said, I think laws, anti-abortion laws, have almost nothing to do with the fetus or the embryo or the fertilized egg, because she doesn't want to call it a baby. She said they have everything to do with the role of women in society today. It's all about the dignity and agency of the female half of the population, and that's what's at stake, frankly. Frankly, crap. That's bull. And the idea that this woman who was a New York Times Supreme Court reporter, can't even imagine that people on the other side might be concerned for the life of the child, and conceive of that life differently than she does. It's funny. I admit, I say all the time that I understand why people want abortion rights. I understand the problem they're trying to solve. I just don't think you're allowed to solve it by taking an innocent life. It's not like I think, they're sitting there plotting to destroy America through abortion. Maybe some of them are, but I don't think that's the main thrust of the argument on their side. She can't even, this person who covers the Supreme Court, can't even acknowledge that there are people on the other side who have sincere feelings and sincere, passionate beliefs about the baby in the womb. She can't even acknowledge it. Why? Because she doesn't even have to. So what about the court? Would they do anything? So far, I think only Clarence Thomas has ever made a comment casting suspicion on Roe v. Wade. The rest of them have kept quiet, and they've even seemed a little shy to deal with any case that might bring Roe under review. But recently, there was this really obscure case, the Franchise Tax Board versus Hyatt. Really obscure subject in which they were debating whether one state could sue, whether you could sue a state in another state's court, right? And the Supreme Court had earlier said in Nevada versus Hall, they said that you could do this. But now they reversed it. They reversed it, and mostly the conservative judges voted to reverse that case. And Clarence Thomas, in saying this, said what is called stare decisis, which means let the decision stand, was not something that he said it's not an inexorable command. It's kind of a tradition that you leave precedent in place, especially if it's going to disrupt all of our lives, disrupt the law and all this stuff. You leave the precedent in place, and if the legislature wants to change it, or they want to change the Constitution, they can do that. And Justice Thomas, in making this decision, reversing the fact that you can sue one state and another state's courts, said, stare decisis is not an inexorable command, and it's at its weakest when we interpret the Constitution, because our interpretation can be altered only by constitutional amendment, right? So he says when we call something unconstitutional, we should be able to reverse it if it's wrong and not force the people to amend the Constitution in order to correct our mistake. A perfectly reasonable argument. But the left went crazy because stare decisis is the way they are protecting Roe v. Wade. In other words, they know, even the MSNBC legal analyst knows, it's a weak, stupid case, right? But they're defending it because it's there. That's the argument. It's already there. You can't overturn it because of stare decisis. And the idea that Thomas and the right undermine stare decisis in this very obscure case is driving them a little crazy. Toobin, again, going back to CNN's Toobin, he makes the case.
It was about a really obscure issue, as you point out, of sovereign immunity. But Justice Clarence Thomas, who wrote the majority opinion, devoted his entire opinion, basically, to describing the circumstances when the Supreme Court should overturn their own precedents. And this precedent, in that case, was almost exactly the same age as Roe versus Wade. And the language that Justice Thomas used was very similar to the language that has been used to urge the court to overturn Roe v. Wade. And Stephen Breyer, in his dissent, he cited one of the big abortion cases as an example of the kind of case that would be overturned by this kind of language. So all the forces are converging on this issue of whether Roe will be overturned and allowing states once again to ban abortion, which many, many states will.
You know, I have to say I would have a lot more sympathy for the stare decisis argument if I thought that it applied in both directions, but of course it doesn't. Hillary Clinton ran her whole campaign on overturning, not her whole campaign, but throughout her whole campaign, she ran a campaign that she would say appoint judges who would overturn Citizen United, which limited your freedom of speech rights. We know that they are dying to overturn Heller, which gives you, secures your individual right to own firearms. So we know that they're not going to let stare decisis get in the way of anything they want to overturn. It's always one way. It's always a ratchet with the left. It always turns only in one direction. And so that whole argument to me is nonsense. Of course, if they've made a mistake in their ruling about the Constitution, it should be overturned. Of course it should. That's ridiculous. And so, I think, will they do it? I don't know. But I think that I still don't know because of Kavanaugh and John Roberts have not been very reliable votes. Kavanaugh probably more reliable on abortion. Roberts, I'm just not sure whether he has the nerve to do it, basically. But the point I'm making is it would be good for everybody. Everybody should want it overturned because everybody should want to get back to the idea of engaging with each other, with your fellow Americans, and having conversations and having arguments, passionate arguments, but polite arguments that are followed by a vote so that one side wins and another loses, but the issue can always be turned around by another vote. The argument goes on forever, but at least the argument has a result because you have the power to make your own laws. That's what the court took away from you with Roe v. Wade. It wasn't giving you rights, it was taking rights away from you. Same with the gay rights amendment. I think gay people should be, gay rights decision, I think gay people should be against Obergefell because I think they should want to make their arguments to their fellow Americans in their states and win the argument there. I think they would have won it. I think that the court just seizes power when it thinks it will get away with it. I really do. I think that is what they do. The temptation to seize it when they feel the zeitgeist going their way.